Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel really daunting. And that's why, for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need it the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. To find out more, just go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, simply go to their website, which is www.swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday morning, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're abroad for today's episode. We're going across the ditch to talk to our Kiwi cousins. We're going to have a chat to Neale Jones, who was a former Chief of Staff to Jacinda Ardern. He now runs his own Gov Relations shop. We've had Neale on the show plenty of times before. I'm sure you remember Neale from previous episodes. We're going to be talking about the New Zealand elections. The national elections are on October 14. So it's 10 days away. Early voting has already begun. And Neale's going to come on the show just to give us a bit of a state of play of how that race is going between Labor and the Conservative Party over there, which is called National. So check out that on today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Podchaser. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I'm just triple checking that. I have just landed from overseas and I have no idea what day it is. I'm jet lagged like a MFer. And my guest today is actually under the weather a bit from just recovering from the flu. So both of us are going to battle through this podcast. He's been on the show before. He is the Managing Director for Capital NZ Government Relations. He was a former Chief of Staff to the former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and he's back on the show today to talk to us about the New Zealand elections, which advanced polling has already begun, and the election is going to be held on October the 14th, which is the exact same date as the referendum here in Australia. Neale Jones, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, good to be here.
Excellent. Beautiful backdrop. Love that painting. Did you do it yourself?
No, my landlord's a guy called Bob Jones, who's a famous right-wing figure in New Zealand and a property baron, and he has a lot of art, and he just gives it out to his tenants to have, so I picked it.
Love it. Property baron. Beautiful. All right, let's jump into the race, because the election campaign, because it's, we're in October now. Amazingly, this year's gone so quickly. It's days away till the election itself. For those of us who are not in New Zealand, our non-New Zealand audience, can you sort of set the tone, not the tone first of all, but the state of the race? 120 seats in the House of Representatives. You need, was it 61 seats to form government? How many's Labor got at the moment? And then let's talk about polling after that. But first of all, just give us a sort of a snapshot.
So Labor's got an absolute majority of Parliament at the moment, which is a very rare thing historically, but they managed to, off the back of the successful COVID-19 response, get that support in the 2020 election. National's a shell of itself. It's, from memory, about 30-odd seats.
34?
Got an absolute shellacking in 2020. And This time, Nationals recovered. They're polling now, they got about 20% odd in the last election. They're currently polling sort of 39-40% in most polls. And Labor's gone from polling 50.5% in the general election 2020 down to around 27-28. So quite a slump in support over the last 3 years.
Now, we've talked about this before, but just to remind our audience that it's rare since the New Zealand electoral system moved to this current electoral system, use your word, Stephen, multi-member electorates plus with the list, it is absolutely rare for a government to have outright majority, and Labor did achieve that in 2020. So the likelihood is actually normally you've got to form a coalition with other parties. Now, what are we seeing here in terms of the alignment politically in New Zealand? Who would Labor be looking to form a coalition with, and who would National, who are the centre-right party, looking to form a coalition with?
So you've basically got two blocks. You've got Labor, you've got the Greens, and you've got Te Pāti Māori, which is the Māori party. That's on the left. And you've got a right block, which is National and ACT, but based on recent polls, are likely New Zealand First as well. Labor and the Greens have worked together in 2017 to 2020 term. They worked together in government. This term, even though Labor had an absolute majority, they formed a cooperation agreement which gave the Greens ministers in the government. So the climate change minister, for example, is the Green Party co-leader. And Te Pāti Māori had previously been with National, and they lost all their seats in Parliament eventually as Māori voters, who tend to be on the left, rejected that. And they've taken quite a shift to the left as a party under new leadership and are very firmly aligned with the Labor-Green bloc. On the right, the one thing of note is you've got National, which is our centre-right party, ACT, which is kind of a free market libertarian party that indulges in culture wars. And then you've got New Zealand First, which previously was in coalition with Labor, 2017 to 2020. That didn't end very well. They're kind of quite a sort of, at times, Pauline Hanson-ish party. They sort of want the economy to turn back to where it was in sort of 1978 and kind of take quite a very socially conservative / reactionary view on social issues. And they've ruled out Labor this time, and Labor's ruled them out. So they're in that right block.
And they're led by the New Zealand's equivalent of a politician, like a turd that won't flush, Winston Peters, correct?
I would never describe him like that, Stephen, but yes, he has been around for about 40 years. He is a household name. He has been involved in multiple governments, and most of them have collapsed or ended up in disgrace. He's a very interesting character, sort of one of a kind, and he's taken quite an interesting turn in the last couple of years. When we had that big protest at Parliament with the occupation from the anti-vax movement, he went down there. They had, this movement had nooses out. They were threatening to hang politicians. It was pretty ugly stuff. He went down there and greeted them, and that was sort of seen as very odd. He was the Deputy Prime Minister with Labor who shut the borders and did the lockdowns. But he had a bit of a flip, and he's become the champion of the sort of anti-vax, anti-mandate movement, and also kind of indulged in quite a bit of sort of anti-trans rhetoric and other sort of, anti-co-governance with Māori. It's hard to know whether he believes it or whether he's sort of seen an electoral opportunity to come back. His party was thrown out of Parliament in 2020, and I think he saw an opportunity with some of these fringe movements that had emerged post-COVID and post sort of, a lot of people getting internet brain, and he's kind of latched onto that and managed to get himself over 5%.
So between the two blocks, looking at the current polling, what is the National and ACT currently polling at collectively?
Yeah, so the latest polls have them kind of National about 40 and ACT sort of 8 or 9. So they're getting close to a majority. The last couple of polls that have come out show them sort of getting maybe sort of 59, 60 seats. They need 61 to govern. So they'd need New Zealand First to form that majority. I think, given the momentum in the media Winston Peters has got, and given last week Christopher Luxon finally stopped his dance of refusing to comment and admitted that he would work with Winston Peters and New Zealand First. New Zealand First has got momentum, and I think it's pretty likely they'll be needed.
Okay. Let's talk about, you started to touch on a bit about the tone of the campaign. I'm interested in you to get a sense of what has been the tone of the campaign thus far.
It's been an odd one. On the one hand, because Labor's polling sort of slumped near the start of the campaign, It hasn't been the close fought campaign we thought it would be. A lot of the focus has been on what form of government National would form rather than the sort of Labour National battle. But I think more disturbingly, there's been a level of kind of vitriol, violence and hatred that we haven't seen in recent times. And I think this comes off the back of some of the COVID conspiracy theories and the so-called freedom movement, or the cookers as they're otherwise known. There's been cases of, obviously, quite racist abuse in some places against Māori candidates, particularly women who are Māori. There's been the Māori Party candidate in Hauraki Waikato had a home invasion, which she's later complained with police and says that there was clear signs of political motivation for that. There was, we've had, Labour candidate Angela Roberts was slapped by a man at a public meeting recently. So there is a level of, kind of menace in the air that we haven't seen in New Zealand democracy in the past. We've famously had a very open democracy. One of the things I've always been proud of is, I remember when I lived in the UK, if you try and get into their parliament, it's, it's surrounded by security and bomb barriers and all kinds of things. In New Zealand, people sit on the lawn of parliament and eat their lunch. You see your MPs just wandering without any security, just wandering down Lambton Quay buying a coffee, and you bump into them and say hi. My worry is we're starting to move away from that because there's that level of menace, and even beyond the menace. I mean, there's one of the various fringe parties. I think it's Destiny Church, one of the Destiny Church-based ones, has this guy Karl Mokaraka, and he's just been basically storming into political events and just trying to disrupt them, and along with supporters. And so Labour's campaign launch, for example, was disrupted by religious fanatics and anti-vaxxers just standing up and shouting and having to be removed by security, and the whole thing got delayed for 10 minutes. This has happened to the ACT Party. Nationals had press conferences disrupted like that. So there's kind of even a sense of, we're not going to allow the democratic process to take place. We're going to intervene and disrupt. So I think the end result of that is you end up with more security, less public participation, and more things choreographed in small groups of trusted supporters, which I think is bad for democracy.
I'm interested. I completely agree with you there. I'm interested in getting your thoughts about how this plays out in the minds of voters. How have the two major parties, the Centre, the Labor Party and National, handled this this change in tone in the campaign? Like those that are perpetrating violence against Māori candidates and Labor candidates, obviously, I'm assuming they're coming from the right. And there are connections to National in some way because they're entering into a coalition.
It's more connections to sort of New Zealand First and that conspiracy crowd, I think, who they're appealing to. And I don't think these people are members of New Zealand First necessarily, but there's a continuum from your sort of fringe conspiracy 0.5% parties through into New Zealand First and maybe ACT with some of the anti-Māori stuff. And I think
they're bedfellows with National, right? I mean, the leader of National should be held to account. And I mean, have we done that in this campaign, or has the media done that? Rather?
I mean, Chris Hipkins gave a very good speech actually recently on this, where particularly focusing on Māori, because that's where a lot of the focus has been, where he gave a very strong defence of Labour's work in partnering with Māori and against parties that either race bait for votes or who tolerate race baiting. And there was a group of, I think, 20 iwi leaders, so tribal leaders, who wrote an open letter in support of that and called on Christopher Luxon to disassociate himself from this. And look, he has said that. He's been very sort of careful not to be on the wrong side of this. He's not someone who's race baited himself, but he's sort of he's sort of tried to benefit from this kind of thing without endorsing it, if that makes sense. He's certainly not been a vocal critic of it. He's kind of been on that continuum where he says, well, I think we need one law for all and we need one system for all, and we're very concerned about how giving Māori advantages and it might be bad for democracy and all this kind of thing. So kind of putting it through a liberal democratic framework, as opposed to ACT and New Zealand First, who have been a lot more vociferous. But I don't think the public necessarily are blaming Christopher Luxon for this behaviour or anything, but I think it does possibly highlight some of the fringe movements that are on the right who his government would be relying on. And that's part of that instability he faces is a national Act New Zealand First government would be chaotic, potentially unworkable, and would have some quite interesting characters. New Zealand First has some quite credible candidates. There are previous ministers. They've got the former mayor of Wellington. They've got some good people who are standing. They've also got some people who are open conspiracy theorists on their lists. And there's been Act New Zealand First have had a series of media stories about candidates of theirs who have been involved in, the Nuremberg trials, Telegram groups, and believe COVID's a conspiracy and climate change isn't real and all this kind of stuff. So, I think more people are sort of seeing that, and it raises questions about how Luxon will manage this.
It's interesting, I think you and I were talking off air before we recorded. That tone and tenor that you're talking about came out in the Victorian state election as well, less so in the federal election for some reason, or maybe it was happening, but it wasn't getting reported. But certainly in the Victorian state election, you couldn't not report it. I mean, we had a member of the then upper house at an anti-vaxxer rally on the steps of Flinders Street Station call on those in the crowd to assassinate the Premier of Victoria. And we saw the leader of the Liberal Party, Matthew Guy at the time, really play, and many within his party play footsies with a lot of this sort of fringe element. And I think it came back and really, really hurt them in the end. Labor increased their majority by an additional seat after it already had a landslide in 2018. And I just wonder but it's not just going to be always up to the media to hold, or to shine a spotlight on the inconsistencies of the centre right and their attraction to working with some of these nut jobs. It's going to be on us as well. And I'm just trying to get a sense of, is there, with the remaining days left, like 10 days left, is there a chance for us to start to really, because doubt is a good thing for people to have in their minds when they go and vote, right?
Yeah, and look, Chris Hipkins did a really good, there was a moment in that last News Hub debate where he challenged Chris Luxon, and he said, look, he read out a quote from a New Zealand First candidate, and I haven't got it verbatim, but it was quite disgusting. It basically said, of Māori, we have the cultural mandate as a party to cut out your sickness and we will bury you, kind of words to that effect. And he said, turned to Luxon and says, why will you work with these people? And that was a really powerful moment. And so that kind of doubt, I think, is important. And one of the things Labor's doing in this campaign is raising those doubts and fears about what this sort of government will look like. I think where the public is right now is that, cost of living is a real issue in New Zealand. It's the major issue in the campaign. And when you're the incumbent government and inflation's at 6%, floating interest rates are up at 8%, it's a very hard environment to run in, because there's no easy fix to that, and you get the blame. And even though much of it is a hangover from COVID or international reasons, you get the blame for it. And so my sense, and from what I hear around people who are politically connected and see polling, is that, people are sort of saying, I'm not sure about Labor because of the way cost of living is and because of interest rates. But they're not sold on National and Act in New Zealand First either. Your middle voters aren't saying they love Christopher Luxon. They still have serious doubts about him. And they're not really sold on the policy prescription or even the stability of the government, of what the government would look like. They're kind of in the phase of, we'll give it a hoon. We'll roll the dice and see what the other lot are like. And so Labor's been, they are trying now to sort of say, well, hang on a second, what is that alternative? What does that change look like? Whether they can pull that back is an open question. I think it will be very hard from here to pull it back, but they may be able to recover the vote somewhat and force Luxon into a rather tricky coalition agreement with both Act New Zealand First that becomes quite unpopular quite quickly.
I mean, you know your own political landscape better than anyone, hence why you're on the show. But listening to what you're talking about, you're right. I mean, when you're campaigning in tough economic conditions and voters are feeling it, then it is difficult. But I do think of two examples. The 2004 Bush-Kerry presidential, when Bush was president, worst economic numbers ever. He had the worst approval numbers of any president post-war, and they were in this war in Iraq that no one wanted to be in, and he still managed to win because he could frame up his opponent as someone you couldn't trust. He was a flip-flopper, all that kind of stuff. He looked French. And so people didn't, they stuck with Bush, which is incredible. And then 2019, here in Australia, Scott Morrison versus Bill Shorten. We all thought we were going to win. The economic conditions weren't great then. Once again, managed to frame up your opponent in a way that in the end voters went, and it was only late really that it happens, and it's still 10 days to go. I guess I'm trying to be glass half full here kind of guy, but I just want to get a sense from you, like, are we starting to see elements within the Labor campaign where they are just finding creases to run through?
So, I mean, to be honest, with 10 days to go, one of the difficulties is advanced voting has started, and they reckon probably at least half of the population will have voted by election day. So every day there are fewer available voters. So it does get hard.
Yeah.
And Chris Hipkins, unfortunately, has come down with COVID-19, which has put a spanner in the works of his campaign. He's sort of campaigning from a hotel room in Auckland right now. But all that being said, there are opportunities for Labor. National's tax plan has been absolutely panned. Their tax plan does not add up. They promised these big tax cuts quite early on, about a year and a half ago, and they never explained how they're going to pay for them. And they've had to invent, they'd let foreign buyers come into the market and they'd put a tax on them, but they've over-projected the number of people who would be buying them, and the economists have panned it. They've relied on public spending cuts, on a new online gambling tax, which relies on more New Zealanders gambling overseas and not knowing what a VPN is. It's been totally panned. Every credible expert says your tax plan makes no sense. So that's something Labor's been able to sort of hit National on credibility-wise. Doesn't seem to have impacted with voters yet, because voters are still seeing that through the prism of, well, I might not get my tax cut, but, I still feel like change. What Labor's started to do, though, is say, actually, because you can't pay for that, you're going to have to take money out of health and education. You're going to have to cut actually things that matter to people. And they released their fiscal plan last week, which, in order to make their numbers add up and their debt targets they promised and all their tax cuts, they've also said we're going to take $2 billion out of benefits in the next 4 years. So basically saying, instead of increasing welfare payments by the average wage on an annual basis, they'd increase it by inflation, which is going to be a real material hit on the lowest income people, and will send thousands of children into poverty. So they've made a point of that, which is just a stunningly mean thing in a cost of living election, when they're offering billions of tax cuts to landlords and property speculators. They're taking billions off people reliant on welfare checks.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. Who's the base that National are trying to go after? Like, it's obviously it's not compulsory voting, so you've got it's a turnout election. But I'm assuming there are a core group of voters that there are sort of undecideds that you need to flip over to expand your base. Who's National going after?
Yeah, look, it's your middle New Zealand. It's people on relatively middling incomes who live in a suburb in a city. Like it's basically your core swing voter. And that's who they've been ruthlessly targeting with cost of living and crime. I think part of what's worked well for National is they've managed to get away with very little scrutiny of what they're planning. They've had a lot of sort of bumper sticker slogans about how they'll give tax relief and sort out the cost of living, and they'll crack down on gangs and crack down on crime. And their actual policy ideas are absolute nonsense. For example, apart from the tax plan not adding up, when you look at their crime policies, there's been a series of issues where kids have been committing ram raids, where basically kids will steal a car and drive into a shop and steal stuff. And Labor's been doing interventions where they turn the kids' lives around. 80% are not reoffending. It's a hugely successful program. Fantastic. National's alternative is to throw them into military boot camps, which was tried under the previous National government and had 80% failure rate. So, and so when actually challenged on these things, they kind of fall apart. But they work quite well as sort of, slogans. And I think what was remarkable about that last debate, the News Hub debate, where Chris Hipkins won quite comfortably, was because of the format of the debate was a bit more free-flowing than the previous one, he could actually challenge Luxon on his bumper sticker slogans. He could say, well, how's that going to work? What about this? What about that? And actually managed to expose that he didn't actually have answers, that when you get beyond the key message he's been trained in relentlessly, there's nothing underneath it. And so I think that's another thing Labour's managed to start to do in the last couple of weeks, is to really highlight the hollowness of some of National's policies and how unworkable some of them are.
You've mentioned the debates a couple of times, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on your thoughts on how the debates went, but also just to let the listeners know that these debates can be a signature moment in the campaign. Whereas in Australia, they don't mean shit because no one watches them, right? They're literally watched by everyone that's working on the campaign, rank and file Labor Party and Liberal Party members, and journalists. That's who's basically watching the debates in Australia, right? But here in New Zealand, I was struck by this when I caught up with you when I was over in NZ a couple of months ago. You guys said, no, the debates actually mean something in this campaign. Why is that?
I don't know. I think we just have a culture of it that, hundreds of thousands of people watch the debates. And they've, as you say, they've been quite consequential. In 2011, when Phil Goff was Labor leader, his campaign had a devastating blow in the Christchurch press debate where John Key went through his plan, his economic and fiscal plan, and then just turned around and said, show me the money, into this big theatrical thing about show me the money. And Goff just had nothing, was humiliated, and that was kind of the bookend of Labour's campaign. It was kind of all over, let's go home at that point. David Cunliffe, when he was Labour leader in 2014, also got caught up on, John Key turned to him and said, he had a capital gains tax policy, and John Key said, do I pay capital gains on my house if it's owned in a trust? And and David Cunliffe kind of was confused and kind of didn't really have an answer. And that was a sign people took that he wasn't across his policies. So these moments in these debates can be quite consequential. And I think there were a few moments in that News Hub debate, nothing devastating like that, but where Hipkins was able to make Luxon look like he was dodging the question, or he didn't have answers, or he wasn't quite prepared for the job. And it's no surprise that, the press debate, which is the hardest one, it's an hour and a half long. It's a town hall format. That's the one where Goff and Cunliffe both went awry. Chris Hipkins, obviously having COVID, can't do it. He's offered new dates. Christopher Luxon's running scared. He's just refusing to do the debate. And that's because I think he realises that the biggest risk to him is having the hollowness of his policies and the inconsistency of them showing up.
How many debates have there been thus far?
So there's been 2 debates, and there were supposed to be 2 more to come. So there's 2 TVNZ debates, one on TV3, that's News Hub, and the press debate. So given the press debate's been canned, there's 1 more to go.
Right, and so the press debate was meant to happen last night, wasn't it? Tuesday night?
I can't remember, to be honest.
Read an article
It's this week anyway, yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. So that one's just not going to happen. So there is going to be one more debate, but it won't be in that same sort of town hall format.
No, it'll be TVNZ. And hopefully TVNZ's better. The first debate this year was on TVNZ, and it was a pretty dull debate. I think, to be honest, neither Christopher Hipkins or Chris Luxon were firing. They were both kind of quite low energy. And the format was very much question, stop, which meant you got key lines and nothing much more. And I think a good debate actually allows the two to tussle and have a bit of back and forth, and that's when you can actually start to unpick some of the policies and expose some of the inconsistencies.
In terms of the media coverage off the back of these debates, obviously you said that Labor did well in the first 2.
Well, I'd say the first one was basically a draw, but the pundits gave it to Luxon because they felt Hipkins had to win it. Yeah. And then the second one, Hipkins won comfortably.
Right, okay. So Chris wins the second one quite comfortably. Do you see momentum in the media then afterwards start to then actually pick up on some of the things that were identified in the debate and start putting pressure on National?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, so much political media is about momentum. And when you're coming from a low polling base like Labor is, the challenge you face in that sort of election campaign is everything you do is cast as a desperate failure. And I think winning that debate made Hipkins look like he was winning, gave him some momentum, and gave the media a chance to kind of run that comeback story, which is so critical in those moments. And I think it also, putting Luxon under pressure on working with New Zealand First and ACT and how that would work kind of helped to stoke some of that discussion in the media about the risks of a unstable, chaotic three-way coalition.
I want to talk about where the campaign goes next, but before we do that, we have to talk about the fact that the Prime Minister is currently, as you said before, in a hotel room in Auckland with COVID. It happened to Anthony Albanese, albeit at the start of the campaign. Still you don't want it ever to happen. But it wasn't a complete disaster for the Australian Labor Party campaign when Albo got sick. It just meant that others within the campaign had to step up and actually were quite good at carrying the campaign message. And it was just interesting coming from different voices, got great grabs. And I thought that it actually helped the campaign reset because the first week wasn't great for Albo. He gets sick. Probably doesn't hurt for him to spend 5 days just watching the campaign, and then he comes back out again. It's almost like, go sit on the bench for about 5 minutes and then just sort of, collect your thoughts, but then comes back out and is much stronger. And I'm just wondering, obviously you don't want the top of the ticket person to be stuck in a hotel room for, 5 days leading up to election day, particularly while people are voting. But how is the campaign going to re-strategize to deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a strategy you choose, right? But you do your best. And I think the timing was unfortunate because it was off the back of that debate win. It was off the back of National's fiscal plan coming undone and Luxon coming under pressure on his coalition options. And he sort of felt like he had that momentum. And the risk is that it stops that. But Labor's, they've carried on. They're doing a lot more online stuff. So he's very active. He's still doing interviews. He's doing a big Zoom town hall. He's doing sort of Facebook Lives. So he's still being active, and you're right, others have stepped up. So Grant Robertson, the finance minister, and Kerry McAnulty, the local government minister, they held a stand-up yesterday where they did a fantastic job, laying out how National's plan to repeal Labor's water infrastructure reforms was going to push up the rates bills of households by thousands of dollars a year and call them out for not having any plan. And that went really well, actually. So I think they can manage their way through it. It's hard to say at this point what impact it will have, but hopefully Chippy's back on his feet and able to sort of next week really hit the ground running. I mean, it is that critical get out the vote period. You want to be on the news each night, being active, being out with people, showing you've got a good campaign. It is hard to get those images when you're stuck in a hotel room.
So what does the final weeks of the campaign look like? Obviously, the ground game is out there knocking on doors, targeting Labor voters, driving them to the polls, sometimes literally. What's the top line campaign going to focus on?
Yeah, so interestingly, because we have advanced voting in New Zealand for 2 weeks, starting 2 weeks before polling day, and we have quite high advanced voting, the parties got most of their big policy out already. You're not going to see any big policy announcements in the last 2 weeks. You might see a couple of minor ones, but there's diminishing returns there. The focus now is just getting people to the polling booth, making the case, the key messages about the risk of change and why it's important to keep Labor, but then also just getting, on the ground, just get out the vote, going to state housing areas, going to core Labor areas, and just getting them to the polling booth, drive them if you need to.
And in terms of actually trying to frame up the national coalition, if you were the campaign manager, what are you going to be focusing on in terms of your core messages as a contrast against your opponents in the last couple of weeks?
I think there has to be a question about what kind of country we are and what kind of government we risk having. Because I think a lot of, as I was sort of saying before, I think a lot of people aren't sold on Luxon and the policy. He's pushing, and they're very worried about what an ACT and New Zealand First partnership looks like. So I would be very clearly highlighting the risks, which is a government of cuts, a government that's going to cut public services, that's going to cut the incomes of the lowest New Zealanders. And I would be talking about the chaos that will ensue if Luxon is trying to manage Winston Peters and David Seymour from New Zealand First and ACT. And I would be trying to give some hope that Labor has a positive vision and that there is a brighter future around the corner. Because I think part of Labor's challenge is a lot of people have given up hope things will get better because of the tough economic conditions. I think Labor does have to offer that hope as well as fear.
I'm just looking at the polling at the aggregated polling. I'm just trying to find where they've listed the undecided vote, but it doesn't seem to do that. Do they do that in New Zealand polling? Because it just seems like they've attributed everything to all the different parties.
No, there's a company Essential that does polling for New Zealand polling for the Guardian, which has undecideds. But typically we don't do undecideds. We just fold them in with distribute that to the other parties.
Right. So the reason why I'm asking that is just trying to get a sense of how much of an undecided vote is still out there that exists whilst people are actually currently voting that up for grabs.
Look, when I talk to Labour strategists, they tell me that they are confident there are a lot of people out there who haven't made their minds up yet, who, they're inclined towards change, but they're still not sold.
Yep.
And so, there is an opportunity over the next 10 days to, give those people enough hope in things getting better and enough reason to doubt what a change might look like that you might start to turn some of those around.
All right. Well, Neale Jones, thank you very much for coming on the show again. We do appreciate your time. For those of you who are in New Zealand and are supporters and listening to the show, go and volunteer your time. The Labor Party have got a great field campaign running right now. Go out there and help folks drive people to the polls. Wherever you may be, there's organisers in all the major cities across the North and South Islands to get involved. And I'll put some links up in the bio for today's episode where you can volunteer your time. Neale, let's talk again after the 14th of October and do a bit of a debrief. But until then, good luck and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Cheers.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.